In Chapter 8, we learn how to best communicate the status and the progress of the project with those who are most interested and need to be informed about our project. Our learning objectives in this chapter, chapter 8, is to understand informal organization and in particular contrast that with the formal organization that exists. We also learn about stakeholder identification and analysis. We talk about project communications plan, which is a plan to make sure that we keep all the key stakeholders informed of the status of the project. We will discuss a very effective methodology. It's called earned value for monitoring and forecasting a project's progress. And lastly, we look at some of the technology solutions that are available for collaboration in general and project collaboration in particular. All right, let's talk about formal and informal organization. The formal organization is what we generally see on organization charts. Basically, it shows how individuals or groups within an organization should relate to other people in the organization. Either they're reporting to them, or they have a dotted reporting relationship, or they are peers in the organization. This is all shown on organization charts. But the fact is that how individuals or groups within an organization actually interact with one another and how they are related to one another may be, and in many cases is, different from the formal organization. And this is something that you have to learn about the organization so that you are in the position to know who the key stakeholders are and identify the ones that have or will have a lot of influence on your project, but they may not be shown on the organization chart. So what are the attributes of the informal organization that exist within the formal organization? The informal organization, typically the lines of communication bypass the formal lines of organization. So people may report or discuss things with people who are not in their chain of command. And in an organization like that, also the power of people and their influence is gauged by how well they're connected in this informal organization or informal network, and how well they're connected to the grapevine in the organization. So this can be much more complex than the formal organization, that you can actually take a look at the organization chart, and the formal organization is very straightforward. This informal organization is based on many years of relationships and working relationship that they have had, and those may have resulted in really strong and positive relationships or very negative relationships. As an example, consider a situation where a person who reports to you has a very good, close relationship with your boss. Perhaps they had worked together before for many years, and maybe they go out to lunch frequently. And if you take that example, that person, that employee of yours, may have a lot more information about what is going on in the organization, hearing that directly from your boss than you're aware of. You can see how that complicates the relationships and makes it tricky. That's why the awareness of this informal organization is very critical in developing your communication plan. When we are thinking about a communication plan, one of the first things we should consider is who are the stakeholders of our project. These are the individuals or groups, can be even organizations or companies that have a stake or claim in the project outcome, be it successful or unsuccessful. So when you think about your class project, for example, a company that can be very interested, a good stakeholder in your project is the company that will provide you with the software that you will be implementing. That's an example of a stakeholder. And of course, the doctors, nurses, and the other people who would be benefiting in the healthcare organization, those are all typically stakeholders of health IT projects. After developing the list of stakeholders, then we are going to conduct an analysis of the stakeholders in terms of their interest in the project. We simply will go down and decide who has positive interest in this project. We'll give them a +1. Those who are neutral, we give them a 0, and the ones who actually are interested for the project to fail, we would give them a -1. Next, we need to determine the level of influence that each stakeholder has on the project. It can be determined on a scale of 0 to 10. 0, essentially, they have no influence. 10, they actually can terminate the project. So they have a lot of power on the project. This is where we would benefit from our knowledge of informal organization, because as we discussed before, the power that individuals have in an informal organization really is the power that they hold in reality. And knowing that, then we can do the analysis of our stakeholders and define a role for each stakeholder in terms of where they will be. Will they be a champion who will be the cheerleader and will promote the project? Would they be a consultant where we need to get their expert opinion on certain areas? Are they decision makers? They're people who can actually cancel or terminate the project. Are there our allies, and or are there our rivals, and etc. Since we have to base this on our knowledge of informal organization, this is generally an analysis or the work that we generally would not publish publicly, because it may offend other people, the stakeholders that we have identified in the document. Then we will identify an objective for each stakeholder in terms of if they are people who can provide resources to us, or provide guidance or expertise, or provide approval at certain points for the project. And then we identify a strategy for each stakeholder in terms of how to build or maintain or improve or reestablish the relationship, that our relationship with that stakeholder. Typically, an individual on the team is identified to manage the relationship and communication to each stakeholder. This is an example of a stakeholder analysis you can see that they have identified the stakeholders in the first column, and then they determine their interest on the project. The plus ones, they are interested in the success of the project, and minus one meaning that they're not supportive of the project. They would like to see it fail. And then the next column determine the influence or the power of that person over this project, and then identifying some of the potential conflicts that there may be with this stakeholder, and an objective for how we want to deal with this stakeholder. In this particular case, being a project sponsor, we need that person to provide resources, approval, and public support for the project. And the strategy that we establish for doing that is to maintain open communication so that political landmines can be avoided. So it's a frequent communication with this project sponsor, and making sure that that project sponsor is aware of where the project is, and make sure that it's going in the right direction. This is another interesting visual for explaining stakeholder analysis and stakeholder strategies. I saw that in Wikipedia, and looking at the two axes, as we have been talking about, the level of interest of the stakeholder versus the power. So the people here, the latents and promoters have a lot of power on the project. In terms of their interest, the latents don't have much interest, and we basically, our strategy has to be to keep them satisfied, while the promoters are the ones that have a lot of power and a lot of interest in the project. Those are the folks that are most important to the project, and we need to manage them very closely. And the people who don't have a whole lot of power, the apathetics are here with low interest, low power. We basically monitor them. We don't put a whole lot of effort, but we kind of monitor to make sure that they would not cause problems for the project. And the ones that are interested, but they may not have a lot of power, they are definitely our defenders, and we want to keep them informed. Hopefully most of our project team members fall here, and we got to make sure that we keep them informed along the way. Keep in mind that the project sponsor and other stakeholders do not like to be surprised, so always report accurately. There may be cases where something happens unexpectedly. Maybe some of the original estimates were not accurate, and you may need to make adjustments to project schedule and budget. It's far better to go ahead and communicate those situations and propose the adjustments or any mitigation measure that you put in place, rather than trying to hide the problem with the hope that maybe you can fix the problem without informing the project sponsor and other stakeholders. You will improve your credibility by reporting issues that come up, but then addressing those issues and getting the project back on track is where you will gain the respect of the organization. So remember to always keep your stakeholders informed of all events that happen on your project. So we have talked about our stakeholder analysis and strategies to managing our stakeholders. A critical element of that overall strategy for managing our stakeholders is how we are going to conduct our project communications. And this can be a formal plan or an informal plan that we develop. Generally, it's recommended to have a formal plan, even if it's pretty simple and straightforward. But the plan for communication, it basically has to address how are we going to keep all stakeholders informed of what is happening on the project, and you basically have to answer the typical questions of who are we trying to get the information to, what do they need, and how can we meet their need. Would it be face-to-face meeting? Would it be a written report, or would it be a website that we update? And when do they expect that? How frequently do they expect to see that information? We don't want to be too infrequent in terms of providing the information. At the same time, we don't want to overwhelm our stakeholders with information and reports. And of course, then we also need to talk about what format, in what fashion do we most effectively share that information. Would it be in written form, in graphical form, and the like. When we are putting together the project communication plan, we have to keep in mind some key aspects of the project, such as the nature of the project that we are reporting on, how complicated the project is. We have to keep in mind the stakeholders that we are targeting the communication to. And of course, the focus of the communication is to bring our stakeholders up to speed in terms of any changes to the scope, the status of the schedule, budget, the quality, and any risks that we are encountering and how we are responding to those. On all of those parts of the project, we need to be focusing on updating the metrics, the performance measures that we have established, again in terms of schedule, budget, and the like. We have to provide an update on what deliverables have been completed and which ones that were supposed to be completed have not, the milestones that were reached. And in terms of how frequently we provide that information, the update to, most commonly the frequency is monthly, but for smaller projects, typically the frequency would be more in shorter intervals, probably on a weekly basis. And also we need to decide how we are going to provide the update. In many cases, face-to-face meetings are good, but at the same time, people would like to have some reports, written reports. And of course, if we are communicating to a large group of stakeholders, like future users, we may be using newsletters and emails. Now, let's take a look at an example of a project communication plan for a project that is longer than 6 months. It's not a very short project. In this example, we have identified a number of stakeholders. Let's start with the sponsor, or could be the client. The frequency of the meeting would be monthly. Every month we need to update the sponsor or the client with essentially a project summary. They are more interested in knowing overall how the project is and if there are any issues that they need to be aware of or deal with. So typically you have an indication of how you're doing with the overall cost, with the overall schedule. Hopefully you apply earned value and make some forecast in terms of final costs and the like, and other metrics that you have agreed with the sponsor or the client to you provide updates during these monthly interactions. And as you can say, it says that it's in this particular case, it was planned during a periodic review meeting. So it's not an additional meeting that is imposing. It's always good if you can have the project updates tied with some ongoing meetings that you have in the organization, so it's not an additional burden on everybody. Next, we look at the project manager. In this case, the assumption is that the project manager is not directly involved necessarily with all the project teams. Maybe there is a design team, maybe there is a programming team or implementation team. So the overall project manager needs to be at least be aware of the status of the project and where the critical tasks are, how the milestones are being met, and how the project team is performing on the overall budget and schedule. Moving on to the project team. The project team, they can be just the design team or testing team, or for a smaller project, it could be all of the members of the overall project team. They need weekly updates, and their interest is mostly what needs to happen in the coming week, and of course what has happened in the previous week, and some of the specific focus areas that the team needs to have to make sure that the project is progressing well. Now let me share with you a project reporting system that we established at US Courts while I was the Chief Technology Officer. I have mentioned to you before that project management activities was part of my office's responsibility. So we develop and propose an IT project management process that was approved by our executive management team and was instituted for large projects. These were the projects that were over $1 million. And the requirement was to report on each project, to report on a monthly basis. And the report included key information about the project name, the project manager. This is to establish who's accountable and responsible for the project, a short overview of the project, and then, as you notice here, we also wanted to make sure that it's very clear what the business value or measurable organizational value are, and that's captured here. Talk about the organization and the ownership of the project. A quick or very short overview of the project status, looking at some of the deliverables and milestones of the project and how they were planned and how the actual date ended up being. Then there was an assessment by the project manager in terms of how he or she views the status of any of these deliverables or milestones. The green one, on track, means that she feels in this particular case that everything's going well, and she didn't highlight anything at risk or trouble. Of course, the project also reported on the budget, um, the status in terms of the actuals that they have spent and what they estimate to be the final budget. Those are whited out for the confidentiality purposes. Based on the individual project reporting, then the system was able to generate a trend map of basically the last 6 months of the project, how it had performed. In this particular case, the project had only 4 months had been in existence. So uh, this trend map, it was a nice summary to paint a picture of how the project has been managed, and in this particular case, we see that over the first 3 months, everything seemed to be going pretty well. In the fourth month, the project manager has assessed or has expressed a lot of concern about the scope. In this particular project, that was the time that the project team recognizes that the scope is greater than what they had anticipated. So as a result, the risk of the project and the schedule of the project is somewhat in jeopardy, and they have highlighted those. What I would expect over the following months, that this project shows that they have controlled the scope and risk, and if needed to, we would have updated or re-baseline the project if the scope of the project has increased to a different level. Based on the individual project reports, then the system put together a project's executive summary for the office chief, the executive who was responsible for each office, and they were sent out to them so that in a glance they can see the status of their projects. This particular report was actually for my office, the Technology Solutions office, and as you can see at the time, we had a total of 12 ongoing projects, and the first set of projects were related to implementation of new technologies, and at that time they were all on track. One of those projects was completed, so I would have expected that that project would drop off of the reporting the subsequent month. And then I also see that another project, the OpenShift project, was waiting for funding. Another group of projects that we had were research and development type of projects, and I can see that we had one project at the time there that was also pending the funding, and it was in the planning stage. The last group of projects that I can see in this report, they were dealing with the proof of concept initiatives. These were the new technologies that we were experimenting how applicable those technologies were to the US courts businesses. And we had projects such as machine learning and sentiment analysis, and those projects were on track and busy with a number of pilots. Of course, if any of these projects was at risk or troubled, I would have expected that the project manager had indicated as such. And as we discussed in the previous slide, I would have expected that that project would get back on track in the subsequent month, or if needed, we had to have the discussion of rebasing the project. As you have noticed, project metrics are an important element of project reporting. These are quantitative measures of various attributes or objectives of the project, typically, as you would expect: scope, schedule, budget, quality, risk, resources. These are the type of metrics that would be typically shared on the project, again, as you saw in some of the examples that we looked at. As you can see, metrics have a big role to play in project reporting. And then the question is, what's a good project metrics? These are some of the attributes for a project metrics to needs to be understandable and it's intuitive. So when you look at it, you immediately understand what aspect of the project is being measured and how it's being reported. It has to be objective, no bias. That is true in many cases, but at the same time, I think some subjective assessment is makes sense. As I shared with you in U.S. courts, we actually asked project managers for their subjective judgment of all aspects or major aspects of the project in terms of scope, cost, schedule, risk, and the like. So I think quantifiable is fine, it's good, but we should consider both objective and subjective measures. They should be a good project metric has to be cost effective. It doesn't make sense to spend a lot of project resources in gathering some information that has very low impact in terms of the overall status of the project. It has to be important, kind of goes along with the cost effective. If it has to be important, it has to be worthwhile measuring it, really. And it has to be high impact. This is something that people would care to hear about. Otherwise, really, why bother reporting on it? You can see on the graph, this is a nice, quick way of communicating a project metric. In this particular case, they're reporting on budget, and really they are looking at how much of the budget we have spent and how much do we have left. And as you can see in this particular case, you can quickly understand from this chart that the project is actually doing better in terms of the budget than what it had planned to be at this point. So it's a pretty good visual to communicate the information about the budget. Frankly, I personally would think that it would make sense to flip the 0% to be on the left side and 100% to be on the right side, typical to any x-axis that we draw. It seems that that's more intuitive, going back to the first point we made about metrics. So we talked about project metrics, and now let's look at some of the attributes of the project management system reporting. I shared with you how we did that in US course, but some of the items that are pointed out in the textbook is that it makes sense for the project management system to allow the team to gauge its own progress rather than somebody else try to estimate the progress of the team. And it should really focus on a few measurements, not, clearly not more than 5 or 6 measures. Otherwise, then we get into the area where the metrics and measurements may not be worth the effort that it would take to produce them. So the measurement system, obviously, the focus of it should be to track results and progress. And the textbook says that it needs to be designed by the project team. And I differ on this particular point. I think there is a need for some uniformity of reporting. Some, at a very basic level, I think all projects need to report important and basic information, and I think it's important for that to be widely available in the organization so that there is a clear transparency. And also, when you have uniformity, it is a lot easier for executives and top leadership to look at any project report or summary of all project reports and quickly know how the format of those reports and what they should be looking at. Again, similar to the example I showed you earlier. We saw a visual, a gauge, essentially a couple slides back, where it was used to demonstrate the actual spending versus the budgeted amount. Another chart that is very useful for demonstrating progress is burn down chart. You may recall we have talked about burn down chart a couple times. It's very popular in agile software development methodology. It essentially shows what portion of the scope, features, and functionality are being completed on the time scale over time. And this also gives a pretty good picture of what is the throughput, what is coming out of each iteration or each sprint. And looking at the trend, it's easy to, it helps to predict when all the scope or all the features are implemented. You may recall that our guest speaker, Dr. Baker, mentioned about using burn down chart even in other areas such as risk, showing basically all the risks that exist and which ones are addressed, and kind of show the progress in terms of addressing risks. That's another example of a metric that can be reported through burn down chart. So this is an example of a burn down chart. As you can see on the y-axis, we have the scope. It can be measured in any way that makes sense for the project in terms of features or functionality. And then on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, you have time, or the sprints or the iterations are shown basically on the horizontal axis. In this particular case, they're demonstrating that they're showing that iterations 1, 2, 3, there was certain burn rate or velocity, and it seems like that velocity was picked up a little bit more in iterations 4, 5, and 6, as they're shown on the right side. But essentially, burn down rate or velocity is at the rate they can complete and knock down these features and functions in the product. So it's an effective way of not only measuring how well we are progressing, but also have a forecast of how we can get done with all the scope and the features and the functions that we need to be delivering. Earned value methodology is a tool that provides a performance measurement for a project. it basically tells us how much of the budget should have been spent for the tasks that have been accomplished. For example, let's take this hypothetical case that you have signed a contract with a consulting firm and for developing an IT system. The contract amount, the budget is $40,000. The duration for the project is 4 months, and the tasks that you have identified, or the consulting firm has identified, there are 20 tasks. And again, to make this hypothetical case easy to follow, these tasks are all the same and they're evenly divided over the 4-month period. So basically, for each task, you're paying $2,000, and you expect to have 5 tasks completed every month. That's the background on the project. This slide shares the same information in a tabulated form. The same project with 20 tasks. Each task costs us about $2,000, and we are expecting to have 5 tasks completed every month. Therefore, we expect the project to be completed in 4 months. There are many terminologies and abbreviations in earned value approach. Let's start learning some of those. Planned value, PV, is essentially the budgeted cost of the work scheduled for each activity or component of WBS. In our example, the planned value for each task is $2,000. Since we expect to complete 5 tasks every month, therefore the planned value, or PV, for each month is $10,000. Another terminology, budget at completion. BAC is essentially budget, what we refer to as the total budget for our project. In our example, that's $40,000. And BAC, or budget, is really the total cumulative of planned value of all the tasks. Again, we have 20 tasks, and each task, the planned value is 2,000. So BAC, the total budget, is 20 times 2, which is $40,000. So this chart is a good graphical depiction of the two terms that we just learned. The planned value is the line that starts from 0 at the beginning of the project, and it goes up by $10,000 every month. So that shows the planned value at any point along the project. And we see that the point, the end of the line, is budget at completion with BAC, which in our case is $40,000. Let's continue with our example, and let's say that we start our project with Dewey, Cheatham, and Howie, and at the end of the first month we receive an invoice from our consultant for $8,000. So the question is that, are we in a good shape? Are we on track? Are we behind? The fact is that we really don't have enough information from this invoice to answer those questions. Therefore, just an invoice is not an adequate way to report the status of the project, and you'll see why I say that in a minute. So on the face of it, this invoice actually looks pretty good. It looks like good news. We expected to pay $10,000 by the end of the first month, as you recall. But now we are only being billed for $8,000. But the question that, again, the invoice does not answer is that how much work have we accomplished for that $8,000? As we turn to the second page of the invoice from our consultant, we see that they have actually reported the work that is completed in the first month. So they were able to complete task 1 for $2,000, task 2 and 3, each of them for $3,000. So if you recall, we expected to complete 5 tasks every month. Not only we have not completed 5, we only completed 3, but also 2 of the tasks, tasks 2 and 3, are costing us about 50% more than what we expected. We estimated that they will cost us each $2,000, and now we see that they actually cost us $3,000 each. So the picture may not be as good as we thought may be the case from the first page of the invoice. Let's continue with some additional earned value terminology. Actual cost is the actual cost that is incurred for completing a task. In our case, tasks 2 and 3, each of them had the actual cost of $3,000. Also in our example, the 3 tasks that were completed in month 1, the total actual cost for them was $8,000. Earned value, on the other hand, is the value that is earned by the work that is completed. What that means is that earned value is really the portion of the budget that we really should have spent for the work completed. In our case, we need to pay the consultants $8,000 in actual costs, even though the earned value or the estimated value of those tasks were only the value was only $6,000. So that $6,000 is the earned value for those 3 tasks. So this table is a good example of reporting what we have discussed on this example project over the last several slides. So this shows the tasks that are listed for month 1 through 5. Shows that the planned value for each task, and then the actual value or actual cost, it should have said really, actual cost on the top for each of those tasks, and then finally the earned value for those tasks, which is basically in this case is what we had budgeted for. So we can see that everything is very nicely summarized, and so the cumulative planned value should have been $10,000. The actual value or actual cost, again, it should have said the actual cost is $8,000, and the earned value is $6,000 at the end of first month. What does that mean in terms of the future of the project? Can we use this information to forecast what would be the final cost of this project and final schedule or duration for this project based on the performance that we have seen in the first month? Before we answer that question, actually, let's take a look at yet another way to sharing the information about the status of this project at the end of first month. Of course, this graphical form doesn't have all the details that we saw in the previous table, but nonetheless, it's a very good summary chart for people to know where the project stands. Now let's take a look at a graphical representation of the information that we have on this project so far. So this is a chart showing the expenditure on the vertical axis and the month that we are in on the horizontal axis. As you can see, the top line is what we talked about a few slides back. That's the planned value line. Then, as you can see, by the end of first month, that's at $10,000. And the continuation of that, or the final amount, is the budget at completion, that is $40,000. To that, now we add the actual cost line, which at the end of first month is $8,000. And as we talked, the $8,000 actual cost actually equates to $6,000 worth of earned value. And the earned value is shown on the orange line. Based on the information that we have on our project, we can now develop some key metrics, performance metrics, as well as conduct some analyses, such as looking at the variance in terms of cost and schedule, as well as looking at performance indices for cost and schedule. We'll take a look at those in more detail in the following slides. Let's start with one of the cost metrics, the cost variance. This is essentially the difference between the task's earned value, which is the budgeted amount for that task, versus its actual cost. So in the terminology that earned value uses, CV is equal to EV minus AC. Cost variance equals earned value minus actual cost. So in our example, it is the cost variance is actually minus $2,000. The fact that the number, the variance, is negative, it is telling us that the project is over budget, and in this case, it's over budget by $2,000. Another cost metric is similar to cost metrics. The first schedule metric we look at is schedule variance, SV. And this is basically the difference between the current progress, or the earned value progress, versus the original or planned or budgeted for the same amount of same period of time. In our case, the schedule variance, the $6,000 was our earned value, and the total amount that we had budgeted for the first month was $10,000. So it says our schedule variance is minus $4,000. That is basically telling us that we are behind schedule by $4,000 worth of tasks, which basically those are tasks 4 and 5 that we did not complete in month 1. The second schedule metric is schedule performance index. Again, very similar to cost performance index. the SPI is the ratio of earned value over planned value. In our case, the earned value was $6,000, but the planned value or the budget for the first month was $10,000. So our schedule index is 60%. So one way of looking at it is for every dollar of work that was scheduled to be completed, only 60% or 60 cents was completed. Furthermore, the ratio of less than 1 tells us that the project is behind on schedule. The lower this is, this index is, the farther we are behind in our schedule. This table summarizes all the project performance and performance metrics that we have discussed in month 1. It shows all the tasks, and we have now added the 4 metrics we just talked about in this table. Earned value methodology offers pretty effective tools for forecasting the outcomes of a project. The 2 terms that we are going to look at in that context, one is estimate at completion, EAC. Basically, EAC is the estimated or forecasted final cost of the project based on the performance that you have seen so far. And variance at completion is forecasting the budget overrun or underrun at the end of the project, again based on the performance of our project to date. Our forecasts for the outcomes of the project would vary greatly depending on the project situation. We are going to look at 4 different scenarios. The first scenario is if we think that the performance in the first month of our project was atypical, meaning that that is not what we forecast our performance would be in the future. We think we are maybe picking up some productivity because the project team have gelled together. So what we saw maybe the first month, we may think that this is an isolated case, and for the rest of the project we would be fine, or we would perform as we had forecasted. The second scenario is we forecast the cost and schedule outcomes of the project based on the assumption that what we saw in the first month will be typical performance of the project, and as such we should expect that our performance continue the same way as we observed in the first month. The third scenario is that we forecast that similar to case 2, that the variances are typical, so we are going to have similar performance on our project based similar to what we saw in the first month. But in this case, in scenario 3, the budget is also fixed. In the fourth scenario, we realize that looking at the first month's performance and the estimates that were put together, looking at those, we realized that we had some fundamental problems with our estimating. So the estimating, we assume it was poor and it needs to be redone. So this is where we would revise or re-estimate the project. So let's look at each of these scenarios in more depth. The first scenario was that we felt that the first month performance was atypical and the rest of the project or performance would be the same as we had originally forecasted. In this particular case, as you can see, if we work out the numbers for estimated at completion, we see that we essentially increased the estimated completion or the project budget by the $2,000 that we are short in terms of our budget at the end of month one. So at the same time, the variance at completion, which is the difference of the original budget versus the estimated actual cost at completion, is minus $2,000, meaning that we, based on our observation, we think that our budget shortfall of $2,000 would be all we will experience at the end of the project. In the second scenario, as you recall, we are forecasting that the performance of our project will be the same as we observed in month one. In that case, then what we are going to do is that we are going to extend the earned value graph all the way until we reach the $40,000 earned value, meaning that this is where we are going to implement all the features and everything that on all the tasks that we were going to carry out. And as we do that, we see that the forecasted project schedule would be 6.7 months rather than the original 4 months. But furthermore, we see that our estimated at completion is $53,000. And when we calculate the variance is minus $13,300. So that's for case 2. In the third scenario, we have the same assumption as we had before, but which is the performance of the project will be the same as we saw in the first month, but we also constrain the schedule of the project to the original 4 months. And that's difficult to show graphically, but essentially when you work out the numbers, the estimate at completion is going to be $83,500, and you see the point there in the upper right of the graph. And then the VAC accordingly is now minus $43,500. The fourth scenario is when after we look at the estimates for the first month and the performance in the first month, we determine actually that we have had a poor estimate put together for our project, and we need to basically re-baseline or re-estimate our project. So we focus on all the remaining tasks and we develop a bottom-up estimate to complete for all the remaining tasks. Then we add the actual cost of the tasks that we have already accomplished in the first month, and that will be our EAC or estimate at completion. And then when we have that, then VAC can be a straightforward calculation. Another relatively new metric that has been introduced in earned value and project management body of knowledge is to complete performance index, TCPI. This is basically indicating the future cost efficiency that is needed for the project to hit a particular cost objective, either be the original cost or the cost that we have re-estimated, which is the estimate at completion, EAC. So based on so essentially it's measuring the ratio of remaining work over remaining funds. And so the remaining work is budget at completion, which is the original budget, minus the earned value that we have earned so far in the first month. Divide that by the remaining funds, depending on where we are or what situation we are in. If we are under budget and we are still targeting the original budget, it would be BAC minus AC. But if we are over budget and we have estimated or we have established estimate at completion, EAC, then the index is at the bottom, you have EAC minus AC. At any rate, in our case, in our example, the project is over budget, so we are using the second formula that is shown here. Since our project is over budget, based on the performance in the first month, we use the second formula for TCPI, which is shown here. We apply that formula to the first scenario that we had, and not surprisingly, TCPI turns out to be 1.0, meaning that so long as we maintain the same cost productivity as we estimated in our project budget, that we should be fine. In the second scenario, to complete performance index, TCPI is 0.75, and in the third scenario is 0.45. Table 8-4 in the textbook has a nice summary of all the formulas and calculations that I showed you in here. There are a couple of mistakes that I found in some of the calculations, and I've corrected those in the slides that I shared with you. Our project reporting should communicate the performance of the project, the progress that the team has made, and the forecasts for the outcomes of the project. The progress reporting focuses on the current status of the project and basically looks at the actual performance and progress versus what was in the baseline plans in terms of cost, schedule, and scope. We typically highlight the project team accomplishments in the status reporting. Another portion of reporting is forecast reporting, and that's focusing on predicting the progress of the project in the future and predicting the key outcomes of the project in terms of cost, schedule, and scope. So the status reporting typically is done by the project team. In addition to that reporting, a lot of times we have reviews and audits. These can be informal or formal, and the purpose of this is to review the project deliverables and what was supposed to be accomplished, and make sure that all the stakeholders are in agreement of the quality of the deliverables that are put in place. We used to have these review meetings, when I was working at U.S. courts, And typically you have the customers, the management of the user organizations involved, so that you make sure that again the key stakeholders are aware of where the project is and how it's coming along. So when we want to distribute the information on the project, it can be done in a number of ways. Face-to-face meetings obviously are a lot more personal, but typically it's very time consuming if you have a large number of people, but it's definitely a good way to interact with the project sponsor on the status of the project and getting guidance. It can be done through telephone, electronics, mail, email, could be on the website. And in many cases nowadays, projects provide their progress on a blog or wiki or a website that the stakeholders can actually review and even comment in some cases. When you're thinking about communication and collaboration among people, there are a number of factors to consider. One is that are these the folks who are communicating in the same place, or are they in different places? And you can see that that's the vertical axis of this matrix. And the other question is that are they in the same time zone, or are they in different time zones, maybe in different parts of the country or different parts of the world? And that's, as you can see, those are the scales on the horizontal scale for this matrix. So just taking some of these, for example, if you are at the same place and you have same place, same time, of course you can have face-to-face meetings. That would be the most convenient way. While of course all the other technologies and remote activities, you can also use those, but you have something unique, and that's the face-to-face meeting. But if you move up on the top left, this is where different people are at different places but in the same time zone. Then you can have telephone conversation, video conferencing, instant messaging, chat rooms, as well as the other electronic ways of communication on the right side. And then when you are, regardless if you're at different times, regardless if you're at the same place or at different places, your main communication would be through electronic mail or threaded discussion areas. This is like bulletin boards that you would start a thread and other people weigh in. It's interesting to kind of apply this matrix to the situation that we are dealing with right now, which is where we used to have our classes, so we were at the same time, we were at the same place at the same time, and now we are at the different places but the same time. So we are fortunate that we can use the video conferencing as a mean of carrying out our class. When we are deciding our best or most optimal way of communicating with our stakeholders, we have to keep a couple of things in mind. One is that are we going to be in the same place or different places with our stakeholders? And that's the vertical axis of this matrix. The other consideration is that will we be at the same time when we are communicating, or will we be at different times? And that's the horizontal axis of this matrix. So let's take a couple of these scenarios. Of course, if we are at the same time and same place, we the most effective way would be face-to-face meetings. However, if we are at the same time, but we are in different places, then the video conferencing, telephone conferencing, text or instant messaging, and chat rooms are some of the most effective ways to communicate. Then we have to consider if the stakeholders are at different time than us, and we need to communicate. Typically, an email or a collaboration a site or bulletin boards are the most effective ways of communicating, and these days there are many options for those asynchronous communications that provide us with means of effectively communicating with our team. So this concludes my lecture on chapter 8, and thanks for your attention.